What would you do? Imagine this. You dedicate 3 years of your life to a job, working hard, never missing a shift, treating every customer with respect. Then, in one moment, it's all taken away. Not because you failed, not because you did something wrong, but because you did the right thing. That's exactly what happened to Amina Carter. But what she didn't know was that losing everything would lead to something greater than she ever imagined. Watch until the end to see how one act of kindness changed everything. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe to Inspiring Stories Told. Amina Carter had learned the silent rules of Empire Diner within her first week on the job. It wasn't written down anywhere, but it didn't need to be. Everyone knew. The crisp-suited businessmen from downtown? Smile big, serve fast, refill their coffee before they asked. The elderly socialites who lunched after church? Call them ma'am. Compliment their jewelry, pretend you didn't notice the way they wrinkled their noses when a black customer sat too close. Tourists? Be extra polite. They tipped well. But when a working-class customer walked in, especially a black one, the mood shifted. Amina had seen it happen too many times. She'd watched Veronica Hastings, the queen of Empire Diner, middle-aged, sharp-tongued, always watching, suddenly find something more important to do when a black couple stepped inside. She'd seen Colton Reeves, the general manager and self-proclaimed people person, barely mask his disdain when a black mother and her 2 kids slid into a booth near the window. He'd send a waiter over eventually, but only after making it clear that their presence wasn't welcomed. Amina had hated it from the start, but hating something and fighting it were 2 very different things. And she couldn't afford to fight. She needed this job. Amina worked double shifts 5 days a week, sometimes 6 if she could handle the exhaustion. Rent in Charleston wasn't cheap, and her landlord had 0 patience for late payments. Her mother, Miss Lorraine, had been struggling with severe arthritis and high blood pressure for years. The doctors had prescribed medication, but that medication came with a price tag, one that Medicaid didn't always cover. Then there was Jalen, her younger brother. He was in his 2nd year of college, still trying to find his place in the world, still believing that if he worked hard enough, people would judge him by his character and not the color of his skin. Amina didn't have the heart to tell him otherwise. He didn't know she sent him money every month, a little extra here and there for books, groceries, bus fare. He thought their mother was managing it, and Amina let him believe that. He needed to focus on his future, not worry about how hard she was struggling to hold everything together. So she kept her head down. She followed the rules, even when they made her sick. It was a Friday evening rush when Amina saw the rules in full effect again. The restaurant was packed, the scent of grilled steak and honey cornbread filling the air. Conversations buzzed, silverware clinked against porcelain plates, and waitstaff weaved through the crowd, balancing trays with the kind of efficiency that only came from experience. Amina had just finished delivering a round of sweet tea to a table of lawyers in pressed navy suits when the front door swung open and a new customer walked in. He was black. The change was immediate. Veronica, who had been chatting with a table of regulars near the entrance, stiffened. She didn't stop talking, but her eyes darted to the man, scanning him from head to toe. Colton, leaning against the counter, glanced up from the cash register just long enough to assess the situation before turning his back. The 2 younger waitresses near the coffee machine whispered something to each other, then giggled. Amina felt it, the shift in the air. The man was middle-aged, well-dressed, but not flashy. A simple button-down, slacks, polished shoes. He walked with a quiet confidence, but there was something in the way he hesitated just inside the doorway, like he was giving them a chance to prove him wrong. Amina knew what would happen next. Veronica would pretend to be busy. The host, if he were around, would seat the next white customer first. The waitstaff would act as if they hadn't noticed him. Not outright hostility, just subtle, calculated indifference. The kind that made it clear, you don't belong here. We're just waiting for you to figure it out. Amina hated herself for hesitating. She could keep her head down. She could walk away, let someone else deal with it. But then the man met her eyes. just for a second, and she knew she couldn't. She wiped her hands on her apron, grabbed a menu, and walked straight toward him. "Good evening, sir," she said, her voice warm but steady. "Just you tonight?" A flicker of surprise crossed the man's face, but then he nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Amina smiled. "Follow me. You okay with the booth?" "Perfectly fine," he said. As she led him to a seat near the window, she felt the weight of eyes on her. Veronica had stopped mid-sentence, her lips pressing into a thin line. Colton's hands were clenched into fists against the counter. The two whispering waitresses had gone dead silent. Amina ignored them all. "Can I start you off with something to drink?" she asked, pulling out her pen. "Coffee," the man said. "Black." "Coming right up." She didn't ask for help. She poured the coffee herself, set the cup down in front of him, and refilled the sugar caddy on the table. The man glanced around the diner. "You the only one working tonight?" he asked, voice low enough that only she could hear. Amina flicked her gaze toward the counter, where Veronica was whispering something to Colton, both of them barely hiding their smirks. "Feels like it sometimes," she admitted. The man chuckled, the tension easing just a little. He flipped open the menu. "What's good here?" Amina tilted her head, thinking. "Depends on what you're in the mood for. If you want something solid, the pot roast is made fresh. But if you want my personal favorite, the grilled salmon's the way to go." The man raised an eyebrow. "That's so?" She nodded. "Promise you won't regret it." He smiled, small but genuine. "Salmon it is." Amina jotted it down. "Great choice." As she walked back to the kitchen, she heard Veronica mutter, just loud enough to be heard, "She's wasting her time." Amina clenched her jaw but kept walking. By the time she placed the order and returned with a fresh coffee refill, she could feel the shift in the air, the way Veronica's eyes narrowed, the way Colton kept glancing toward the booth, as if waiting for Amina to slip up. Even the dishwasher in the back had poked his head out, looking toward her like he already knew something she didn't. And then Amina realized. She had just put a target on her back, and she wouldn't know how bad it was until tomorrow. The night had settled over Charleston like a thick, humid blanket. The neon sign outside Empire Diner flickered, casting a dull glow over the sidewalk. Inside, the restaurant buzzed with the familiar clinking of silverware, muffled conversations, and the low hum of an old radio playing blues tunes from a bygone era. It was business as usual, until the door opened. The moment he stepped inside, Amina felt it. The diner had its own rhythm, an unspoken social order that dictated who was welcome and who was simply tolerated. She had learned to read the room without thinking, and the shift was immediate. A distinguished older black man stood just past the entrance, his hands resting lightly at his sides. He was tall, refined, his suit neatly pressed, his shoes polished. Everything about him spoke of quiet confidence, a man who had lived through too much to be easily shaken. And yet, he hesitated. Not out of uncertainty, but out of something deeper, a knowing. Amina had seen it before. That slight pause, that careful scan of the room. It was the look of a man giving people a chance to prove him wrong. To show that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. But it wasn't. The shift in the air was subtle, but undeniable. Veronica Hastings, standing near the counter, turned her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge his presence, before deliberately looking away. She kept talking to a customer as if nothing had changed. Colton Reeves, the manager, stood behind the register, counting cash with deliberate slowness. His posture stiffened, but he didn't turn around, didn't greet the man, didn't acknowledge him. The two junior waitresses near the coffee station exchanged a glance, one of those quick, wordless looks that spoke volumes, before they went back to whispering, smirking as if they were in on a joke that only they understood. No greeting. No welcome to Empire Diner. Just silence. Amina felt the weight of it settle in her chest, a familiar ache she wished she could ignore. She hesitated. Her fingers curled around the pin she'd been holding, pressing into the cool metal. She knew what would happen if she stepped forward. She had learned, long ago, that the people who disrupted the natural order of things didn't last long. And yet, as she watched the man stand there, patiently waiting for someone to acknowledge him. She couldn't look away. How many times has he had to do this? She wondered. How many places like this has he walked into, knowing exactly what kind of welcome he's going to get? Maybe it was the slight downturn of his mouth, the way his hands stayed steady, but his eyes carried something weary. Maybe it was just that she was tired of pretending not to notice. But whatever it was, Amina couldn't stay silent. She wiped her hands on her apron, squared her shoulders, and stepped forward. The click of her shoes against the linoleum floor was the only sound as she approached the man. She could feel Veronica's sharp gaze slicing into her, could hear the faint, sharp inhale from one of the junior waitresses. Colton still didn't turn around, but Amina knew he was listening. She forced herself to smile, warm but steady. "Evening, sir," she said, her voice smooth, practiced, even though her pulse hammered against her ribs. The man met her eyes. There was a flicker of something in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or something deeper, recognition. "Just you tonight?" she asked. The man studied her for a moment before nodding. "Yes, ma'am." Behind her, a fork clattered onto a plate. Amina ignored it. "Follow me," she said, gesturing toward an empty booth by the window. "You okay with a booth?" "Perfectly fine," the man said. As she led him toward the booth, the weight of the diner's silence followed her. Every step felt like a challenge. She could feel Veronica's narrowed eyes drilling into her back. Colton had finally turned around, his gaze unreadable, his jaw tight. The whispering at the coffee station had stopped entirely. Amina's stomach clenched, but she kept moving, refusing to let them see her hesitate. She set a menu down in front of the man as he slid into the booth. "Can I start you off with something to drink?" she asked, keeping her voice level. "Coffee," he said. "Black." "Coming right up." She turned on her heel and walked straight to the coffee station. Behind her, Veronica let out a low, dramatic scoff. "She's wasting her time," she muttered, just loud enough to be heard. Amina's grip tightened around the coffee pot. The moment she poured the coffee and set it on his table, Amina knew she had made a mistake. Not a real mistake, of course. She had done her job, exactly as she was supposed to. But here, in Empire Diner, kindness wasn't always seen as a virtue. She was supposed to pretend not to see. She was supposed to take her time. She was supposed to wait for someone else to step in first. Instead, she had broken the rules. And now, every single pair of eyes in the diner was on her. Even the kitchen staff, usually too busy prepping orders, were peeking through the window, exchanging looks. Veronica had stopped pretending to be discreet, her arms crossed over her chest, mouth twisted in a smug, knowing smirk. Colton was still watching, unmoving, silent. Amina's heart pounded. She swallowed, forcing herself to keep her posture straight, her face neutral. The man, Elijah Whitmore, as she'd later learn his name, seemed to sense it. He glanced around the diner, taking in the quiet hostility, the barely concealed disapproval in the air. Then he looked back at her, his expression calm. "You the only one working tonight?" he asked, his voice low. Amina hesitated, just for a second. She glanced toward the counter, where Veronica was still smirking, whispering something to one of the younger waitresses. "Feels like it sometimes," she muttered under her breath. Elijah chuckled. It was a soft, knowing sound. He flipped open the menu and scanned the options. "What's good here?" Amina tilted her head, trying to push down the growing knot in her stomach. "Depends on what you're in the mood for," she said. "If you're looking for something solid, the pot roast is made fresh. But if you want my personal favorite, the grilled salmon's the way to go." He raised an eyebrow. "That's so?" She nodded. "Promise you won't regret it." A slow smile crossed his face. "Salmon it is, then." She jotted it down on her notepad. "Great choice," she said. As she turned to walk back toward the kitchen, she caught Colton watching her. His face was unreadable, but his fingers were tapping against the counter, a slow, measured rhythm. Amina's stomach twisted. She had made a choice. And now, she knew she was going to pay for it. Amina made a choice that most people in her position wouldn't dare make. She could have stayed silent, could have looked the other way like everyone else. but she didn't. And now, with every set of eyes in that diner drilling into her back, she knows the cost of doing the right thing. What would you have done in her place? Would you have risked everything to serve a man the way he deserved, knowing it could cost you your job? Or would you have played it safe? And most importantly, what do you think happens next? The diner had emptied out, leaving behind only the smell of burnt coffee and the low hum of the buzzing fluorescent lights. The weight of the evening still clung to Amina as she wiped down the last few tables, exhaustion pressing against her shoulders like a heavy hand. Elijah Whitmore had finished his meal and left nearly an hour ago, offering a polite nod and a quiet, "Thank you, Miss Amina," before slipping a generous tip beneath his coffee cup. He hadn't said much, but something about the way he looked at her before walking out made her feel seen in a way she wasn't used to. But as soon as the front door swung shut behind him, she knew the real battle was about to begin. She could feel it in the way Veronica kept glancing at her, smirking. The way Colton moved behind the counter with a tightness in his jaw that hadn't been there before. Even the younger waitresses, usually too wrapped up in their own gossip to care about anything else, were suddenly paying attention. Amina had broken the rules tonight, and now they were going to make her pay for it. She was wiping down the counter when Colton's voice cut through the silence. "Amina, my office." Now. She froze, her grip tightening around the damp rag in her hand. The diner was nearly empty, only a couple of cooks finishing up in the back, the junior waitress mopping near the entrance. She turned slowly, forcing herself to breathe, to keep her face neutral. Colton stood in the doorway of his office, arms crossed, ice cold. Amina's stomach twisted, but she didn't let it show. She willed her hands not to shake as she set the rag down and walked toward him. She could feel Veronica's eyes following her, a cruel sort of satisfaction glittering in them. Amina stepped inside the small, stuffy office, the walls covered in faded schedules and outdated health inspection certificates. The desk was cluttered with receipts, a half-empty cup of stale coffee sitting near the edge. Colton shut the door behind her. Then he sighed, shaking his head like a disappointed father, like he was already tired of dealing with her. "Amina," he said slowly, dragging out her name. "You've put me in a tough spot." She frowned. "What are you talking about?" He leaned against the desk, folding his arms. "We're missing money from the register. $200. Amina's heart stopped. Then, just as quickly, it started again, beating harder, faster, a cold wave of disbelief crashing over her. She shook her head. "What?" Colton sighed again, like this was exhausting for him. Like she was the one making this difficult. "I saw you take it." The words hit her like a slap. For a second, Amina couldn't even respond. She just stared at him, mouth slightly open, because this couldn't be real. Then, the disbelief melted into something hotter, something sharper. Anger. "I didn't take anything." Colton tilted his head, feigning concern. "You sure about that?" She felt the heat rising to her face. They were setting her up. She knew it. Colton knew it. And worst of all, he didn't even care if it was believable. She straightened her back, planting her feet firmly on the ground. "Check the cameras," she said, voice steady despite the wildfire raging inside her. "You'll see I didn't take anything." A slow, lazy smirk stretched across Colton's face. The cameras weren't working tonight. It was a trap. It had always been a trap. And Amina had walked straight into it. Her breath caught in her throat as realization settled in like a lead weight. This wasn't about money. This wasn't about the register. This was about Elijah Whitmore. This was about her serving the wrong kind of customer. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "You know I didn't take anything." Colton pushed off the desk and stepped closer, towering over her. "I know you don't belong here." The words were soft, dangerous. Her heart pounded, a mix of rage and fear tightening around her ribs. "You're firing me because I served a black man." Colton didn't deny it. He just shrugged. "Call it whatever you want." Before Amina could respond, the door swung open, and Veronica strolled in, arms crossed, a smirk painted across her face. "Guess you thought you were smarter than us, huh?" Veronica mused, tilting her head. "Thought you could play the hero?" Amina turned to her, fire burning behind her eyes. I thought I could do my damn job. Veronica laughed. Actually laughed. Sweetheart, people like you don't get to change the rules. You get to follow them. Amina's pulse roared in her ears. She had never hated anyone more than she hated Veronica in that moment. Colton sighed dramatically. Rubbing his temples like this was such a burden for him. Look, Amina, you can make this easy, or you can make it hard. She lifted her chin. I didn't do anything wrong. He exhaled, shaking his head. And yet, you're still fired. Just like that. No warning. No severance. No last paycheck. Nothing. Amina felt her stomach drop. Her rent was already past due. Her mother needed her medication. Jalen had no idea she was the reason he could afford his books. And now, she had nothing. The moment Amina stepped out of Colton's office, the entire diner was watching. The younger waitresses pretended to be busy, but their stolen glances were filled with something almost gleeful. The line cooks in the back had gone eerily quiet. And then there was Veronica, smug, victorious Veronica, leaning against the counter, arms crossed, her eyes practically glowing with satisfaction. Amina's chest tightened as she reached for her apron, slowly untying it. She set it on the counter. Veronica snorted. Not even gonna cry? That's disappointing. Amina lifted her chin. You're gonna regret this. For the first time, Veronica's smile faltered. Just a little. And then Amina walked out of Empire Diner for the last time. She barely made it to her car before her hands started shaking. She gripped the steering wheel, staring at her own reflection in the windshield. She had done everything right. She had worked hard, kept her head down, followed the rules, and none of it had mattered. Her rent was due in 5 days. Her mother needed medication. Jalen needed her. And she had nothing. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She ignored it at first, staring blankly ahead, her thoughts spiraling. But then, something made her glance down. Unknown number. She hesitated. Then, with a shaking hand, she answered. Hello. A deep voice came through the line. Steady. Familiar. Miss Amina. This is Elijah Whitmore. She sat up straighter. Mr. Whitmore? A pause. Then, I heard what happened. Amina's stomach twisted. Of course he had. News traveled fast in places like Empire Diner. Yeah, well, she said, voice hollow. I guess I should have ignored you like everyone else. Elijah's next words made her freeze. That's exactly why I'm calling. Amina sat in her car, her fingers. She exhaled sharply, forcing a bitter laugh. Yeah, well, I guess I should have ignored you like everyone else. Another pause. Then, that's exactly why I'm calling. Amina frowned. There was something in his voice. Something that didn't quite fit with the quiet, polite man she had served the night before. She shifted in her seat. Why? Elijah exhaled, and when he spoke again, his voice was firm. Because I own Empire Diner. Silence. Amina's heart stopped. She couldn't have heard that right. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Elijah waited, letting her process, letting her sit with it. Finally, she found her voice, though it was barely more than a whisper. I'm sorry. What? Elijah's tone didn't change. I own Empire Diner. The words hung in the air, heavy, suffocating. Amina shook her head, trying to make sense of it. He had been there, to observe, to watch, to see how his employees treated people when they didn't know they were being watched. Her stomach turned. That meant he had seen everything. Her hesitation, her choice, the way Veronica sneered at her, the way Colton's lip curled with disgust, the way the entire room had turned against her the second she stepped forward. And he hadn't said anything. She swallowed hard. So, you were testing them? Elijah didn't hesitate. Yes. Her fingers tightened around the phone. And me. A beat. You showed me exactly who you are. Amina's breath caught. There was something in his voice, approval, maybe. But it didn't sit right. Not yet. Because then another realization slammed into her chest. He had let her get fired. Her pulse picked up, anger rising like a storm. You let them do this to me, she snapped. Elijah sighed. Amina, you set me up. She was trembling now, every emotion hitting her at once. The humiliation, the desperation, the panic of knowing she had rent due in 5 days and not a single dollar to her name. And this man, this man who could have stopped it at any moment, had sat there and watched it happen. He let them rip everything away from her. Elijah's voice remained steady. "No, Amina, I didn't set you up." She let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Sure as hell feels like you did." A pause. "Then, I set them up." Amina stilled. The words cut through her rage like a blade. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Elijah continued. "I needed to know what kind of people were running my business. And now, I do." Amina pressed her fingers against her temple, her mind whirling. He had let them fire her on purpose. He had let them expose themselves, show their true colors. And now, they were caught. Amina swallowed hard, her voice quieter now. "And what happens next?" Elijah didn't hesitate. "They're done." She blinked. "You mean?" "Fired. Effective immediately." Her heart slammed against her ribs. Veronica, Colton, all of them, gone. For a moment, she didn't know what to feel. Satisfaction? Vindication? It should have felt like justice. But instead, all she felt was exhaustion. She leaned back against her seat, closing her eyes. "What does that mean for me?" Elijah's voice softened, just slightly. "That depends." Amina frowned. "On what?" A pause. Then, "Do you want your job back?" Amina's breath hitched. Her job? Her instinct was to say no, to tell him to shove it, to say she was done with all of it. But then she thought about her mother's medication, Jalen's textbooks, the rent notice taped to her apartment door. And then she thought about something else, the way the diner had been run, the way people like Veronica and Colton had controlled everything. How many other employees had been pushed out? How many other customers had been treated like Elijah? If she went back, if she was the one in charge, she could change everything. Her fingers tightened around the phone. Her voice was steady when she spoke. "Not as a waitress." Elijah chuckled. "No, as the new manager." Amina's lips parted. The new manager. Her. Not Veronica. Not someone else handpicked by Colton. Her. She swallowed hard, her heart pounding. Then she exhaled. "I'll do it." Elijah's voice carried something warm this time. "Good. Be there first thing in the morning." She hung up the phone. And for the first time in hours, Amina Carter smiled. Amina stood outside Empire Diner, gripping the strap of her bag as she took a deep, steadying breath. The morning air was crisp, the sun just beginning to climb over the city skyline. Less than 24 hours ago, she had walked out of this building with nothing. Today, she was walking back in as the boss. Her heart thundered in her chest, but her face remained calm. This was the moment she had been waiting for. She wasn't here to make a scene. She wasn't here for revenge. She was here to make things right. With that thought, Amina squared her shoulders and pushed open the door. The diner was already busy, the scent of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon filling the air. He let the words settle, his gaze sweeping across the staff. "Effective immediately, Colton, your position is terminated." A collective gasp rippled through the diner. Colton's mouth opened, then closed, his face turning red. "You can't. I just did." Elijah's voice was final. "Get your things and leave." Colton looked to Veronica, waiting for her to say something, do something. But she was too busy gaping at Amina, like she was seeing a ghost. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, Veronica found her voice. "This is ridiculous," she spat, turning to Elijah. "You're letting her take over? This nobody." Amina lifted a brow but said nothing. She didn't have to. Elijah stepped forward, his tone sharp. "You're free to leave, too." Veronica's face twisted. "Oh, hell no. Then you'll listen to your new manager." Elijah's gaze flicked to Amina, giving her the floor. She met Veronica's eyes, the same eyes that had looked at her with condescension, the same eyes that had glowed with satisfaction when she was fired. Amina could have gloated, could have rubbed it in, but she didn't. Instead, she simply said, "If you want to stay, things are going to change." Veronica scoffed, shaking her head. Nope, I'm not working for you. She yanked off her apron, threw it on the counter, and stormed out the door. One by one, the rest of the staff gave small, hesitant nods. The culture was going to shift. Some people wouldn't last. But Amina had no doubt. This was just the beginning. And she was ready. The first morning under Amina's leadership felt like stepping into a new world. The tension was still there, lingering in the air like the ghost of a storm that had yet to fully pass. The remaining staff, those who had chosen to stay rather than walk out in protest like Veronica and a handful of others, moved through their tasks with a mix of hesitation and curiosity. They were watching Amina, waiting to see if she would fail, waiting to see if she was going to rule like Colton and Veronica had, through fear, favoritism, and control. But Amina wasn't them, and she never would be. Within the first week, Amina made it clear that things were going to change. There would be no more favoritism, no more ignoring certain customers, no more treating people like they were invisible. Fair treatment for everyone. Some staff members adjusted quickly. Noah, the busboy, had taken to the new order immediately, offering up ideas on how to improve efficiency, asking more questions, actually engaging with customers in ways he had never been allowed to before. Jason, who had once blindly followed Veronica's lead, was slower to adapt. He still moved with lingering resentment, but Amina noticed that he was watching her, watching the way customers responded, watching the way people actually smiled now when they came in. She knew it would take time, but she had time now. For the first time since she had walked through those diner doors 3 years ago, she had the power to make things right. Word began to spread. It started with the customers who had once been ignored, dismissed, or rushed out the door. The elderly black couple that had once sat near the kitchen because they liked the quiet, when in reality, it was because the waitstaff had subtly pushed them away from the front tables, started coming back every Sunday. A construction worker, still in his paint-stained clothes, ordered breakfast one morning and was shocked when someone actually treated him like his money was worth the same as anyone else's. A woman who had once stopped coming after being rudely rushed through her meal hesitated at the entrance one evening. Amina greeted her with a warm smile and a menu. By the end of the night, the woman left a 40% tip. It wasn't long before the diner's reputation began to shift. What was once an establishment that quietly catered to the wealthy and well-dressed at the expense of others was now becoming known as a place where everyone was welcome. And customers? They noticed, and they returned. With customers returning, business boomed. Amina finally had the opportunity to hire new staff, people who actually wanted to work under this new order. She didn't look for people who had the most experience. She looked for people who had the right heart. People like Maya, a young black woman who had quit her last job at a different diner because she was tired of being treated like she was less than her coworkers. People like Luis, a Latino father of 2, who had spent years working behind the scenes as a cook but had never been given the chance to move up. Amina made him head of the kitchen within 2 months. People like Jordan, a white college student studying sociology, who had heard about the changes happening at Empire Diner and wanted to be part of something different. For the first time, the staff looked like the people they served. Diverse, equal, respected. One afternoon, as Amina balanced the invoices at the counter, the front door swung open. She glanced up instinctively, then smiled. Elijah Whitmore had returned. His presence had the same quiet authority as before, but this time, there was something lighter about him. He glanced around the diner as he stepped inside, taking in the full tables, the way the staff moved with purpose, the way customers, all customers, were treated like they belonged. He gave a slow, approving nod. "How's my investment?" Amina smirked, setting down her pen. "Better than ever." Elijah chuckled, his deep voice carrying through the diner. "I knew you'd do well." Amina exhaled, looking around. It had been a long road, a hard road. But as she took in her staff, her customers, the energy that filled the diner now, she knew, without a doubt, it had all been worth it. And this was only the beginning. Amina's story is more than just a tale of one woman standing up against injustice. It's a story about all of us. How often do we see something wrong and choose to stay silent? How many times do we witness unfairness, discrimination, or cruelty and tell ourselves, it's not my fight? Empire Diner thrived not because Amina fought for power, but because she fought for fairness. She believed in respect, equality, and the simple idea that every human being deserves to be treated with dignity. But let's be real, doing the right thing isn't always easy. Amina paid the price for standing up. She lost her job, her stability, and her sense of security in an instant. And at her lowest moment, she wondered if it had all been a mistake. And that's what makes her story so powerful. Because she didn't give up. Because even when she had nothing left, she refused to compromise her values. And in the end, she didn't just win, she changed everything. That's the lesson we all need to remember. Change doesn't happen by waiting for someone else to do it. Change happens when we decide to be the ones who stand up. It happens when we refuse to look away. When we use our voices, when we refuse to accept things as they are simply because that's the way they've always been. If Amina had taken the easy road, if she had ignored Elijah that night, if she had played along with the unspoken rules of Empire Diner, nothing would have changed. But she chose to act. And because of that, she not only changed the fate of one restaurant, she changed lives. She proved that justice is always worth fighting for. She showed that no one should ever have to beg for basic respect. And she left behind a lesson that all of us can carry forward. So now, the question is, what will you do? Will you be the person who looks away? Or will you be the one who stands up? Will you let the fear of consequences silence you? Or will you choose to be brave, knowing that sometimes the hardest battles lead to the greatest victories? Amina's journey isn't just hers. It belongs to anyone who's ever felt like they weren't enough. To anyone who's been overlooked, underestimated, or pushed aside. To anyone who's been told to stay in their place. Because the truth is, your place is wherever you decide it is. And sometimes, the best way to prove them wrong is to show up, stand tall, and take your seat at the table. If this story inspired you, like this video to show your support for Amina's journey. And if you believe in stories that challenge injustice, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next powerful tale. Because trust me, this is just the beginning, and you won't want to miss what comes next.